Now, Diana, in the spring issue of the Claremont Review, you published a marvelous review of two books about, well, one book about and one book by Malcolm X. And in the course of this very wide-ranging and interesting essay, you discussed a whole series of black figures in American literature, going all the way back to Frederick Douglass, and including Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and Malcolm X himself, and of course Martin Luther King. Why those five? Tell us a little bit about them and why you're interested in them.
Yeah, well, one thing I would just say, those are the big five.
The big five, okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are
the
lots
obvious five.
Yeah, there are lots of other figures in African American political thought who are, worthy of notice, but you do first have to pay attention to those big five. And I guess I always find myself most drawn to those figures who have the most heroic backgrounds. And so Frederick Douglass, first and foremost.
Now, how many were slaves?
Frederick Douglass was a slave into his adulthood. He actually became a runaway slave and had to purchase his freedom in a few years after his escape from slavery. Yeah. The other one who was born into slavery was Booker T. Washington. He was actually freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation at about age 9. But in another way, someone like Malcolm X has his own experience with certain modern-day forms of enslavement, his involvement with drugs and sexual license, and he came to understand that really as a form of slavery. Douglass and Malcolm X were both almost entirely self-educated. Douglass teaching himself to read, as a young boy, when he hears his master say, if a slave learns to read, it will forever unfit him to be a slave. And Douglass said from that moment he understood the direct pathway from slavery to freedom.
Now, describe that famous moment when Frederick Douglass turned on his owner, was it? Or someone was about to whip him?
That's the other really formative experience for Douglass. I think there are these two experiences. First, his self-education, which frees him from ignorance. And then this moment when he is subject to the lash. He spent 6 months with this slave breaker. He's been turned over to the slave breaker because, in fact, learning to read did make him rebellious.
Yes.
Did make him unfit to be a slave. And a particularly horrendous beating really recalls him to himself, and he determines to resist. And he engages in a 2-hour hand-to-hand battle with Covey, Edward Covey, the slave breaker. And he says that from that moment,
how did the battle
and
come
Covey
out?
is on. Douglass fought defensively. In other words, he was just determined to resist.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this, throwing him to the ground, that kind of thing, but never actually throwing a punch. Yeah. And after 2 hours, Covey gives up. And Douglass said from that moment forward, Covey never tried to whip him again. And Douglass says, from that moment, I was a free man in fact, though I still remained a slave in form. So a free man in fact, and what made him a free man in fact is that he had freed his heart of fear of death. In other words, he was willing to hazard himself. Right. He was willing to hazard all for liberty.
Yes.
So I mean, one of the lessons that I take from Douglass is that freedom really is something internal. It's about conquering your ignorance and conquering your fear of death. It's not something external. And that this is something that really emerges from the Black experience. I mean, you might make the mistake of thinking, oh yeah, freedom just means...
Just another word for nothing left to lose?
Something physical, right?
Yeah.
But I think all of the great Black thinkers really come to understand this internal element in freedom. And that Malcolm X is one of those who comes to understand that. But that
internal element wants to externalize itself.
Yes, of course. So
they're not content. They're not content to be like Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag free inside, even though they're completely
free within the prison
outside.
walls.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's right. So Douglas says, from this moment forward, I was a free man in fact, but he was determined to translate that into the form of freedom also. But I think that moment guaranteed, in a way, his escape from slavery, or that he would make an escape from slavery, whether successful
and he's the
or
figure
not.
through whom you came to this whole subject, really. And he is a fascinating figure. His autobiography, as you say, many of these men write autobiographies, is fascinating. And he was, of course, both a political figure of note once he was free, as well as a literary figure. Say something maybe about his politics.
His later
just
development. And this actually might get us to the question of how does Douglas stand towards the founding? In a way, this question is most complicated or tortured for him because he lives at a time when slavery still exists. He lives at a time when the fugitive slave law is in effect. Right. He lives before the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so this question of the Constitution and whether it is a pro-slavery or an anti-slavery document is really crucial for him. And he really begins, he becomes involved with the Garrisonian abolitionists.
Yes.
Right?
But he becomes a columnist. A writer.
A writer. After
note.
Becoming a speaker, he first goes on the anti-slavery lecture circuit as a Garrisonian. And the Garrisonian view of the Constitution is that it was, a pact with the devil, that there had been this bargain made that was so tainted, so corrupt, that you really had to deny the Constitution. They called for the annulment of the Constitution. Right. They argued that it was illegitimate to hold office under the Constitution, illegitimate even to cast a vote under the Constitution, even if that vote would have been the vote that brought an end to slavery.
Yes.
Right? That's how morally pure the Garrisonians sought to be. So Douglas begins as a Garrisonian, but then he starts to rethink that. For one thing, just pragmatically, if what you're really interested in is freedom for the slaves, why set for yourself this task of bringing down the government as the first step or the essential step to the abolition of slavery?
He sort of undergoes a political education after his own, literary self-education. And it's very interesting to do that in public, basically. All these stages were known to the world. They were,
by this point, he has his magazine, The North Star. He's coming into contact with the Liberty Party men who were more sort of political action abolitionists. And they subscribed to an anti-slavery reading of the Constitution. And Douglas actually spends a 2-year period where he really thinks about constitutional interpretation. He'd like to move in this new direction, but he doesn't really know yet whether it can be rightful.
Right.
Whether this is really true to constitutional interpretation, to read the Constitution as a more anti-slavery document. And he eventually changes his mind. He announces that in the North Star, saying that he now understands the Constitution to be a glorious liberty document.
That's right.
And he
Wonderful
says
phrase.
And that we will now use the Constitution as a weapon, really, in the cause of emancipation.
And now coming after him, Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, did they see themselves as in his shadow in any way, or influenced? Do they play off of him in a certain way?
Certainly, Booker T, as a young man, as a young boy, he hears these arguments about black inferiority, and he says, my constant recourse was to Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass could do this. I could do this also. Right. This refutes all of the slanders.
And Booker T. Washington, I guess, is famous for, founding the Tuskegee Institute and the doctrine of self-help, and you have to learn how to make a living and economically move forward. Freed slaves do, blacks do, but he was not an enemy of literary culture or learning, was he?
No, I don't think so. Although his I'll answer that one in a minute, but maybe just on this question of his relation to the founding. I think he says less about that because in a way he's less political. As you say, he's really directing the attention of African Americans to what he thinks is the first task, the primary task, which is educational uplift, economic uplift.
Right.
And so, in fact, he is somewhat critical. The only issue I think in which he's critical of Douglass is on the 15th Amendment. And he actually argues that that was probably premature and perhaps unhelpful.
The vote.
Yes,
the suffrage,
unhelpful in raising the question of black political power before whites are in a position to be able to deal with that, to accept that, and before blacks themselves are in a position to exercise political power well,
yes,
and really in their own interests.
Yeah.
So he doesn't actually, Booker T doesn't say much about the Constitution, but he does talk always about Lincoln, and he offers Lincoln as really a model of the kinds of virtues that are required by all Americans, and particularly the virtue of patience, so this sort of gradualism that you get in Booker T. Washington, and the virtue of moral courage.
Right. And how does Martin Luther King, of course, also famously saw himself in the image of Lincoln, or at least, felt Lincoln was very important to his political mission and his, maybe in part to his self-definition. What is it about King that fascinates you?
Well, in a way, I find him the least fascinating.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, of all of these figures. And it may have something to do with the fact that, and this is true of Du Bois also, both King and Du Bois are born into a more privileged situation. They're both sort of members of the black elite, the black bourgeoisie. They're both highly educated. Du Bois educated at Harvard. He's in fact the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard.
And at Berlin.
And Berlin, right? Exposed to Hegel, yes, which you could see in his thought. So, and I'm, I guess, less satisfied with the trajectory in the thought of these more elite black thinkers.
You mean they end up where they began, more or less?
No, they end up in a much worse place. Du Bois clearly moves toward revolutionary socialism. I mean, he eventually abandons America. He immigrates to Ghana and becomes basically a spokesman for Stalin and Mao. And it seems to me that is a terribly sad end for someone whose early writings are so beautiful. Du Bois writes beautifully about liberal education. Among many topics, and King
disappoints too.
In a less pronounced fashion, I think King at the end of his life is also moving leftward in a more anti-capitalist direction, and I think you don't see this trajectory at all in those African American leaders who were more self-educated. So in Douglass, in Booker T. Washington. And I entertain some hopes that Malcolm X, his trajectory is cut short. I mean, as King's is also. Right. So we don't quite know, but nonetheless, on the question of King and the founding, you're right. I mean, he does cite the founders favorably. He cites the Constitution favorably. I mean, in a way, you could say that his great "I Have a Dream" speech is a kind of condensed version of where Frederick Douglass ends up when he speaks of this promissory note.
That's well said.
Right? That's been issued to all Americans.